How's it going, everyone? Landon with Late Model Restoration. This video will cover my in-depth review and install on SVE's SN95 style 5-lug conversion kits designed for the 1987 to 1993 Fox Body Mustangs. Factory brakes on a Fox Mustang are quite sketchy and, lack for a better word, they simply suck. In my opinion, upgrading the brakes on a Fox Body is one of the best things you can do for the car. Converting to an SN95 style 5-lug kit offers much better performance, visual aesthetics, and of course a wider range of wheel options to choose from. This SVE SN95 5-lug kit is the most comprehensive kit on the market to convert your 1987 to 1993 Fox Mustang from 4-lug to 5-lug 4-wheel disc brakes. It does include all the trimmings from rotors and calipers all the way to brake fluid and rear end gear oil. If you're still utilizing a factory 28 spline carrier, then you can go for the 28 spline kits with your choice of either red or black calipers. Now, if you've upgraded to a 31 spline carrier, you'll need to opt for the 31 spline kits, which are currently available with either red or black calipers as well. The calipers that are included in this kit are a 1994 to 2004 Cobra-style caliper and are currently available with, like I stated previously, in either a red or black powder-coated finish with a silk-screened SVE logo. They are pre-assembled with new pads and hardware. The included rotors are a premium offering and are slotted for added performance. The front rotors measure in at 13 inches in diameter and the rear rotors 11.65 inches. Along with the new calipers will be factory refurbished 1996 to 2004 spindles. These are OEM cores, which are media blasted and then thoroughly inspected and are then powder coated for durability and corrosion protection. The rear components will feature Fox-Link rear axles with an SN95 flange for the rear disc setup. Again, these axles are currently available in either a 28 or 31 spline option. This kit will include the correct rear caliper brackets as well as our SVE axle hard lines. This means you don't have to cut and flare the factory lines. Our SVE lines feature similar bends as those factory lines, so minimal bending is required to get those installed into your car. Furthermore, this kit features a 93 Cobra master cylinder along with the master cylinder adapter lines, proportioning valve, front, rear, and center upper axle braided stainless brake hoses, parking brake cables, parking brake cable clips, all needed hardware and fluids for installation. Now for the few fitment notes. You can utilize factory Fox ball joints as long as you place a spacer between the ball joint and spindle so the nut doesn't bottom out on the ball joint. If you choose not to do this, simply press out the factory ball joints and install 1994 to 2004 Mustang ball joints. Also keep in mind wheel and tire choice. Quad shock removal may be required as well as rolling the rear fender lip. In the front, you may have to trim the wheel well liner or the front spat for adequate tire clearance. These modifications will differ based upon the particular setup you're going with. A little disclosure before I begin the install, you will see two different cars in this video. We are using clips from our 4-lug rear disc conversion since the majority of the steps are the exact same. I am also going to include the correct way to modify your parking brake assembly to eliminate the factory self-adjusting feature. To begin installation, support the car via a lift or jack stands. Remove both rear wheels. Remove the sway bar if equipped. Position a drain pan or bucket underneath the center section. Loosen and remove all of the bolts except for the top one. This will help keep the cover in place while you pry it open to drain the fluid. Now, go ahead and pry the cover free with a flathead or pry bar. Allow the majority of the fluid to run out of the rear end and then remove the last bolt. Set the differential cover aside for now. Go ahead and scrape away any old RTV from the rear end to diff cover mating surface. Spray quality brake clean into the rear end to thoroughly clean the carrier and the surrounding components. Rotate the carrier so that the crosspin bolt is accessible. Loosen the crosspin bolt and then slide the crosspin out of the carrier. Now you can remove the drums from each side of the axles. Push in an axle and then remove a C-clip. Use a rag to catch any fluid that may run out when you remove the axle from the housing. Go ahead and do the same for the other axle. Mark the drive shaft with a paint pen and then remove the 4 drive shaft to flange bolts with a 12-point 12mm socket. Remove the drive shaft from the car and then plug the tail shaft on the transmission. Removing the drive shaft will allow clearance to remove the parking brake cables. Removing the drive shaft is optional, but you don't have to do it. Remove the cable eyelets from the front parking brake cable. Pass the cable through the guides and then depress the clips on the cable retainer with a box end wrench. Now use a combination of a deep socket and box end wrench to remove the hardware securing the brake backing plate to the rear end housing. Use a line wrench to remove the brake hard line. Finally, remove the cable eyelet from the drum brake assembly and remove the 2 cables from the car. Remove the backing plate and then cap the hardline. For the next step, removal of the lower shock hardware will help with additional clearance when fastening the brake line bracket. Position the bracket over the shock mount on the axle housing. Mark the bolt hole with a permanent marker. Mark the area for the alignment tab, or you can just simply cut it off with a cutoff wheel. Once you have the needed marks, remove the bracket, spray some WD-40 over the marked areas for a little lubrication, and begin drilling each hole with a 1/4 inch drill bit. You may have to enlarge either of the holes to 5/16 to get the tab or bolt hole aligned with the shock bracket. Once the holes are drilled, clean the area with brake clean, and then deburr the holes. Secure the brake hose bracket to the shock bracket with the supplied bolt. Repeat those steps for the other side. This kit includes the needed axle lines so you don't have to cut and flare the factory lines. Remove the banjo bolt securing the center upper axle hose to the upper hard line. Remove the nut securing the upper axle hose bracket to the rear end housing. Now remove the upper axle hose and axle line assembly from the car. Install the supplied SVE axle hard lines into the provided crossover block on the braided stainless upper axle hose. The longer of the 2 lines will be for the passenger side. The purple fittings will screw into the upper axle hose block, and the red fittings will screw into the soft line you installed previously. Go ahead and position the center upper axle hose and the SVE hard lines up into the car. Tighten the nut securing the upper axle hose bracket to the rear end housing. Use 2 new crush washers to secure the upper axle hose to the upper hard line. Slide 1 crush washer over the banjo bolt, slide the banjo bolt through the upper axle hose, place another crush washer, and then loosely thread into the upper hard line. Tighten it down and then torque the banjo bolt to 35 foot-pounds. Now carefully bend the new hard lines so that they sit parallel with the axle tubes. Also, you will have to carefully bend the lines so that the red fittings sit flush and even with the soft lines. Once all bends are completed, tighten down all the fittings with the appropriate line wrenches. Double check all of your bends and make sure that the lines do not come in contact with the upper control arms or the rear end housing. Next, reuse your previously removed hardware, securing the brake drum backing plate to the housing. Position the supplied caliper brackets over those bolts. They're going to be marked R for passenger side and L for driver side. Torque the previously removed hardware to 45 to 50 foot-pounds. Next, go ahead and install the dust shields with the supplied hex head bolts. These are not side specific, but should be positioned so that the caliper bolt holes on the caliper bracket are not covered. Tighten down the hardware. Do the same for the other side. Either use a press or carefully hammer the studs into the axles. Once complete, go ahead and wipe down the axles. One at a time, push an axle in, install the C-clip, and pull out to lock it into place. Do the same for the other axle. Reinstall the cross pin and retighten the cross pin bolt, and then torque to 15 to 30 foot-pounds. Reinstall the lower shock hardware. Before reinstalling the diff cover, make sure the mating surface is completely clean and no signs of old sealer is present. Clean your cover and reinstall it. Be sure to either use the lube locker gasket we carry here at lmr.com or apply fresh RTV. You're going to want to torque these bolts to 20 to 25 foot-pounds, working in a star pattern. Slide one of the rotors over the axles. Since they are slotted, the hats will be marked with either an L for driver side or an R for passenger side. Use a lug nut to hold them in place while you install the calipers. Position the assembled caliper over the rotor. Slide 2 of the provided washers over 2 of the provided hex head rear caliper bolts. Loosely thread and then torque to 70 foot-pounds. Slide a crush washer over the banjo bolt. Slide the banjo bolt through the brake hose block. Again, go ahead and place another crush washer over the bolt and then thread the bolt in by hand into the caliper. You're going to also want to torque these banjo bolts to 35 foot-pounds. Do the same for the other side. Reinstall the sway bar. Moving inside the car so we can modify the parking brake assembly. You're going to remove the console top panel first. To see how this is done, click the card in the upper right-hand corner. With the top panel out of the way, remove the 2 10mm parking brake assembly retaining bolts. Loosen the small hex head screw securing the parking brake light switch to the assembly. For the next step, remove the factory front cable from the assembly. Push up on the cable so that you can free it from the eyelet from the recessed groove, and then remove the assembly from the car. Step 1 is to cut the small tab from the self-adjusting spring with a cutoff wheel. I went a step further and removed a little more from the spring. Once that is out of the way, now you'll need to cut off the top tab as well. This is done to ensure that the handle will sit flat and parallel with the floor instead of it being at an angle. Weld the pawl to the handle with the second from the last tooth engaged on the gear drive. Once the cable is removed, cut it in half to remove the receiver and the floor seal. Using an 11/32 drill bit, drill out the center hole in the receiver. Take the Ford Performance cable and position the eyelet into the recessed groove on the parking brake assembly. Reinstall the seal that you removed from the factory parking brake cable on the new Ford Performance cable. Route the cable through the opening in the floor. Reinstall the assembly back into the car. Underneath the car, slide the modified receiver over the threaded portion on the front cable. Use two 8x1.25 nuts to secure the receiver in place on the front parking brake cable. These are not provided and will need to be sourced on your own. At this point, you can go ahead and leave everything loose. First things first, remove the rear sway bar retaining bolt. Position the provided cable guide into place and then retighten the bolt. These are not size specific and will only go on one way. Slide the cable through the guide and then slide the eyelet through the caliper mount and hook it into the parking brake clip on the caliper and secure the cable with the provided E-clip. Transfer the cable to chassis retaining hooks to the new cables and secure them into place with the previously removed screws. Route the new cable in the same direction as the old cable. Pass it through the opening underneath the car until the cable clips into place. Route the cable through the guides and then hook the other eyelet into the front parking brake cable receiver. Do the same for the other side. Now you can run up the first nut to the receiver. Turn this a few times to put tension on the rear cables. Once adequate tension is received, run up the second nut to secure it into place. Go ahead and test for parking brake functionality and make additional adjustments if you have to. Reinstall the drive shaft and retighten the bolts. Unscrew the fill plug on the rear end with a 3/8 extension and a 3/8 ratchet. Fill the differential with 2 quarts of fresh gear oil and friction modifier. Retighten the plug. This will complete the parking brake assembly modification and rear portion of the install. On to the front brakes now. Remove the front wheels. Loosen and remove the sway bar end link retaining nuts from both sides. Position a bucket and a thin piece of cardboard underneath the soft line to hard line connections. Loosen the fitting with the appropriate line wrench and allow the fluid to start draining. Remove the bolt securing the soft line bracket to the frame rail. Remove the 2 caliper slide pins with a 17mm socket. Lift up on the caliper to remove it from the rotor and set it aside. Use a pry tool or flathead to pry off the grease cap from the rotor. Once that is removed, remove the cotter pin followed by the spindle retaining nut. Slide the rotor off of the spindle. Remove the 3 dust shield retaining bolts and then remove the dust shield from the car. Remove the cotter pin from the outer tie rod. Then remove the castle nut with a 19mm deep socket. Strike the side of the spindle to separate the outer tie rod from the spindle or use a joint separating tool. Support the control arm with another jack and position it underneath the spring perch. Loosen the strut to spindle hardware with a 21mm box end wrench on the bolt head and a 24mm socket on the nut. Slide the bolts out of the spindles and strut and then set this hardware aside. Remove the cotter pin from the ball joint. Loosen and remove the ball joint nut with a 24mm socket. To separate the spindle from the ball joint, strike the side of the spindle or use a joint separating tool. Remove the spindle from the ball joint. Here you can either reuse the factory ball joints if they're in good shape or install 1994 to 2004 Mustang ball joints in their place. If you leave the factory ball joints in the control arm, you will need a spacer in between the spindle and the ball joint retaining nut. This will ensure that the nut doesn't bottom itself out. Clean the ball joint and apply a thin film of grease to the tapered stud. Position the new SN95 spindle over the ball joint. Make sure you have the correct side. If you left the Fox ball joint in place, position the spacer over the spindle and then torque the previously removed nut to 129 foot-pounds. Reinstall the cotter pin. Position the strut over the spindle and reinstall the previously removed hardware. Torque the nuts to 148 foot-pounds. Remove the jack from the control arm on the factory caliper. Remove the locking clip from the frame rail bracket with a small pry bar. Remove the bracket and take this time to wipe it down. Position the driver's side hose into the bracket and then reinstall the clip. Reinstall the hose into the car, thread the new soft line into the hard line, and tighten the previously removed frame rail bolt. and then tighten it down. Position the dust shield onto the spindle. These are side specific, but they'll only go one way. Slide 3 of the provided rivets into their designated location, and then use a rivet gun to secure them into place. Clean the spindle and apply some quality grease. Slide the provided wheel hub assembly over the spindle. Thread the spindle to hub retaining nut and then torque the nut to 258 foot-pounds. Install the rotor and use a lug nut to hold it in place. Align the provided grease cap and then lightly tap it into place. Position the assembled new caliper over the rotor. Torque the provided caliper to spindle bolts to 85 foot-pounds. Install the provided banjo bolt and crush washers into the caliper and then torque the banjo bolt to 30 foot-pounds. Go ahead and leave the outer tie rod off of the spindle for now. This is going to have to be adjusted at the very end of the install. Go ahead and repeat these steps for the other side. When moving to the passenger side, the only difference is the small fitting that needs to be installed in between the soft line and the hard line. Go ahead and thread the fitting into the soft line by hand and then tighten it down. Because of the fitting, the hard line orientation is going to have to be slightly altered. Unbolt the frame rail clip that's securing the hard line. Carefully bend the line until the clip can be moved down and then retighten the bolt. Fully tighten the hard line into the adapter fitting. Reinstall the sway bar over the end links and tighten the retaining nut to 14 foot-pounds. Before reinstalling the outer tie rods, back off on the jam nut. This is done by using a series of crescent wrenches. Turn the tie rod counterclockwise and then slide the tapered stud up into the spindle. Rotate the tie rod until the rotor has very little positive toe. This has to be done because of the SN95 spindle geometry. Once you find an achievable point, go ahead and retighten the jam nut. The car will need to be taken to an alignment shop once you finish the install. Loosely thread the castle nut and then torque it to 35 foot-pounds. Reinstall the cotter pin. Repeat these steps for the other tie rod. If you're installing a wider wheel and tire on the rear, double check for quad shock and rear fender lip clearance. You can try flipping the quad shock or completely removing it from the car to clear the tire. Whichever you choose, double check the clearance by reinstalling your wheel and tire. Moving to the engine bay, disconnect the low fluid level sensor on the master cylinder. Position it out of the way and then remove the two nuts securing the master cylinder to the brake booster. Before continuing to the next steps, place several old rags underneath the factory proportioning valve to catch any fluid that runs out. Remove all 3 hard lines from the master cylinder. 2 on the side and 1 on the bottom. Remove the master cylinder from the car. Take this time to wipe up any brake fluid that may have come in contact with painted surfaces. If you do not remove this within a timely manner, it's going to eat through the paint. Remove the 2 hard lines from the factory proportioning valve. Now use an open-end wrench to support the proportioning valve while you loosen the 3/4 inch hex head plug. Remove the plug and then gut the factory proportioning valve. Transfer the O-ring on the factory plug to the supplied proportioning valve plug. Thread the included plug into the proportioning valve and then tighten it down. Install the supplied master cylinder over the studs on the brake booster and tighten down the previously removed nuts. Remove the port plugs and thread the supplied line adapters into the primary cylinder on the master cylinder. This is the port closest to the firewall. Thread the bottom factory line into the T-fitting. Use the other supplied line and install it into the top port on the T-fitting and the back port on the factory proportioning valve. Loosely tighten the fittings. Transfer the factory hard line that was threaded into the front port on the factory master cylinder. Now carefully bend the line so that the upper sitting sits flush. Thread this line into the first port on the factory proportioning valve. Tighten this fitting. Reconnect the low fluid sensor. Locate the union fitting on the passenger side. Loosen and remove the 2 hard lines from the union and toss it in the trash. Thread the supplied line adapters into the in and out ports on the included proportioning valve. The port marked in will go to the line coming from the firewall. The port marked out will go to the line leading to the rear of the car. Tighten down those fittings. Thread the knob all the way in or clockwise to allow full pressure of the brake system. Once the brakes are bled, a setting in between fully tight and fully open will yield a proportionally adjusted line pressure. Now it's time to bleed the brakes. Open the master cylinder cap and fill the reservoir with the appropriate brake fluid. Fill until the fluid reaches the max line on the reservoir. Go ahead and close the cap. Grab a bucket or bottle and a 1/4 inch inner diameter clear hose. Position the hose over the bleeder, starting on the passenger rear caliper. Have someone inside of the car pump the brakes 2 or 3 times and hold. Open the bleeder and then close it. Repeat this until fluid starts to flow. Move to the driver's side rear and repeat these steps, then to the passenger front, and finally to the driver's side front caliper. While doing this, stop periodically and make sure the master cylinder reservoir stays topped off and doesn't run empty. Since I installed new axle hardlines, a new master cylinder, front calipers, and rear calipers, I would repeat this process one more time to ensure all the air is out of the system. Once complete, the pedal should be firm. Don't forget to set the proportioning valve in between fully closed and fully open. Double check your work and then take the car for a light test drive. Finally, enjoy your new SVE 5-lug conversion kit. Overall, guys, this install is pretty simple if you have a good selection of tools and above average mechanical ability. This is something that you can do in your own garage off of jack stands. I would set aside a complete day or afternoon with a few of your friends to help get this one knocked out. To continue watching the absolute best Fox Mustang videos, subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already done so. While you're at it, be sure and pick up this SVE SN95 style 5-lug conversion kit for your 1987 to 1993 Fox Mustang from the real Fox Body enthusiasts, LMR.com.